Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the podcast. With me today, I have Steve Morrell, who is the Managing Director of Contact Babel. Hi, Steve. How are you doing?
I am very well, thank you.
Very well. So, Steve, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. I started Contact Babel in 2001. It's a contact center and CX industry analyst, bit of a mouthful. Right from the beginning, I wanted to base all of our output on hard data rather than kind of, nebulous ideas about what was happening in the world based on, my opinion of, or indeed the opinion of the person that I talked to last. So a lot of our research reports are pretty stat heavy, but if you really need to know what's kind of happening in the contact center stroke CX industry, it's pretty useful. And the fact that most of our research is free to download is pretty useful as well.
Super. So now you've recently published some new research called the UK Customer Experience Decision Makers Guides 2019-20, which I learned about in a recent article that you wrote on mycustomer.com. So can you tell me a little bit about the research? And, is this a periodical thing, or is it a piece of one-off research, or, just to give us a flavor of what we're talking about?
Most of my background on the Contact Babel background is in contact centers, but a few years ago we became pretty much aware that we have to start writing about kind of the wider customer experience as opposed to kind of just contact centers. So CX Decision Makers Guide came off the back of that. It's an annual report. We also do the same thing for the US as well. And it's based on two surveys that we run every year. This year we've got 233 UK businesses, and we also do a survey of 1,000 UK consumers. So the kind of point of that is that organizations can see what the industry and other businesses like them are actually doing in terms of improving CX. And they also get to see what the customers themselves are really valuing, and the kind of disconnect between what businesses think and what customers think is often kind of some of the most fertile ground for the findings.
Right. Perfect. So the thing about the article, that there was a couple of things that really sort of jumped out at me that you mentioned in the article. And so if it's okay with you, I wanted to sort of dig into a couple of things that you mentioned. And the first thing I wanted to ask, you talked about gathering kind of feedback. And in the article, you talked about how email is used by 68% of all organizations to gather feedback, but suffers from low response rates. And you also mentioned that some things that businesses could do to partially address that. I mean, can you explain what those things are, and why do you think those things have not happened kind of like more often, as it were?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the thing about email-generated survey requests is one of the big attractions to them is that they can be sent immediately at the point of service. So, for example, you've got Gartner saying that feedback collected at or close to the point of service delivery is 40% more accurate than that's collected 24 hours later when people have forgotten or moved on to the next part of their life.
Okay.
You've also got situation that email surveys should be in itself pretty easy for customers to complete. It shouldn't be particularly onerous, and you're kind of like able to track the customer feedback based with their specific customer activity. So you've got it improves the kind of overall general view of the customer. Some specific things about email that's pretty positive. It lends itself to open-ended questions, which can be a bit of a mixed blessing.
Mm-hmm.
But they, if you're asking the customer for feedback in their own words rather than forcing them to give you a number based on 1 and 5, you're much more likely to find out what's actually bothering them and concerning them. So that's that works for email. But as you're saying, response rates can be pretty poor. Normally, you're looking at maybe 2 to 10%. Typically, 10% would be pretty good, to be honest with you.
Right.
You can improve that with, as I say, sending stuff at points of service delivery in real time. So that especially obviously works with a kind of online environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you maybe get it, up to around 20%, 15-20%, which is, pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. There's also things like the kind of purpose of it and personalization as well.
Right.
So what you've got, the kind of the purpose of it, it should just be a dedicated email rather than just, oh, here's a load of marketing offers, and by the way, at the bottom of it, here's a survey as well. So it's got to be kind of dedicated. That will help. And the personalization element is pretty key as well, because there's no point in sending out a survey and saying, you should already, the type of information a business should already know, like what the call was regarding, when you last spoke to the business, et cetera, et cetera. It's got to be specific to their last interaction. Because this is kind of a thing I'm going to keep coming back to, is about, the opportunities with personalization, the fact that it's really not been doing, sticking somebody's dear first name on an email is not personalization.
Right.
So really, for an email, best practice might be just ask a couple of questions, maybe 1 score. So, marks out of 10 or NPS or what have you, and 1 about why they gave that score, to try and dig in what really matters to them. But big kind of potential issue is saturation. So if the customer's getting a survey request every time they check the balance over the phone, or buy a box of paper clips or something like that, then they're soon going to stop responding. So maybe businesses need to see if they can link email surveys to a particular type of interaction, say a complex one or a highly emotional one, or something that's needed maybe kind of 2 or 3 interactions to sort properly. So, you're going to get some decent stuff off the back of that, rather than just saying, yeah, the paper clips are amazing, what do you want me to say here?
Yeah. I mean, so are you kind of, you're saying there's actually, there's a really good argument for, because it seems to me that asking for a survey is not just about the feedback. It's like a relationship building tool as well. And
yes.
Actually, you're right. There is a survey fatigue issue, and that you're saying that actually people need to have the courage to, almost like to do less to get more in many ways.
Yeah, I think so. It's about picking the right moment to ask the right question,
right?
And also that will be the right channel as well. I'm not saying, oh, everything should be done by email, because if you're actually just after kind of quantifiable stats, then SMS is going to be a really good thing to use.
Yeah.
Email really just provides kind of the long form. There's a reason why a lot of complaints are done via email. It's because people can sit down and have a good old moan without having to kind of justify themselves directly to another person.
Sure.
They just sit down there and let it all out. So while there's going to be some stuff on there that frankly you probably wish you hadn't read, it is what customers are thinking. So it's kind of, you've got the truth, now what you're going to do with it, rather than just if you can imagine, if you've got 4 paragraphs of closely argued stuff about why you're not happy, rather than just like a number 1 or a number 2 in the NPS, then it's probably a lot more useful to you.
Yeah, and so that just makes me think about this. Do you think there's a danger that people are developing an over fascination with the scores, and that might possibly getting in the way of companies really listening?
Yeah.
Kind of, do they want do they really want the feedback, or do they just want the score? Do you know what I mean?
Again, I don't think that's a simple question, because consistent data, it's key to seeing if improvements are actually happening, and it also allows you to kind of benchmark yourself against other businesses. There's a bit in the report about various average NPS scores, etc., which is obviously useful. And from a just an internal organisational perspective, knowing where you were 12 months ago and where you are now is hugely helpful. But it does need to be tied to the right metrics,
right?
And those will differ by company depending on their specific goals or their the overall company strategy, where they want to be, who they want to be. There's a possibility if you've got a certain metric being held up as the key, then employees they learn to game the system.
Yes.
So if you got, you're back in the good old days when it was all about average handle time, there were lots of tales. I don't know how apocryphal they were about agents, deliberately dropping the call after 3 minutes, so as to keep the call short. And obviously that doesn't help anybody, least of all the customer. Although, if that's what you're being measured on, then it looks great.
Yeah.
So if you've got, metrics like NPS, they say they do allow cross comparison, but those data might be swayed by who's asked the questions and when they're being asked them. So again, there needs to be a certain consistency, and really, anybody who's run a customer survey knows that there's a big risk that any type of survey might only attract kind of high levels of responses from the polarized groups, those who are really happy or those who are really unhappy, and that kind of gives you a bit of a skewed impression of where you are as well. So that's just as applicable in a stats-based thing like NPS as it is in any other type of thing. So I think the key thing, I wish there was a simple answer, but it isn't. It's about mixing up customer feedback requests, when you're asking, at what stage you're asking, what channel you're asking them through, gathering both quantitative and qualitative data. Although, that's all well and good, but qualitative, going back to the kind of, my person with the 4 paragraphs of closely argued insults, that can be dangerous if you get like the amplification effect. So, and this can happen on social media especially. So a small number of very vocal customers with very strong opinions, that can make it seem as though there's a much bigger issue than there actually is. Yeah.
And so, in short, it's like, it seems to me, make sure you understand kind of what you're surveying and for what reason, and also kind of like why, and kind of be very, very selective about kind of when you're asking your kind of customers kind of for feedback, and don't drown them in the feedback, because what you might end up doing is displacing any goodwill.
Absolutely. And that, you can also use something like, say analytics. Analytics allows you to theoretically look at 100% of calls, and from that find out how many customers are happy, how many are unhappy, etc., etc. But probably more useful is for them to say, right, of the unhappy customers, what are they unhappy about, and then start asking customer feedback, more detailed, maybe email customer feedback surveys about that particular thing, rather than just a rather bland and generic, would you recommend us to your next door neighbor? So you can. It's not just a matter of do one survey and then that's it. It's you can blend these things, and as long as you know where you're going, you can see how you're going to get there.
Fantastic. So, moving on to something else that you wrote about in the article, there was a piece where you talked about the sort of CX metrics that senior management consider the most important, and your research uncovered some, I thought was quite stark differences across different sizes of organizations in terms of what they focus on, and in terms of helping them monitor and kind of measure their kind of performance. So can you explain about some of these differences?
Yeah, sure. It's a lot easier if I've got PowerPoint in front of me, but unfortunately I'm just going to have to visualize, or indeed download the free report.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's good, that, isn't it? Right, let's try and break this down as simply as I can. Right, so we gave all of the survey respondents, the businesses, a choice of 8 customer experience related metrics, and asked them to choose the most important one, the one that their board or their senior management would put above all others. Not to say the others aren't important, but what's the number one? So the largest companies that we surveyed, those of over 100 million a year turnover, 42% of those picked out NPS as their key metric. That's compared to only 13% of small businesses and 11% of non-profits. Most of the non-profits are public sector. So, and of those, the non-profits, I mean, they're vastly different from the commercial guys, obviously. Of the non-profits, the public sectors, pretty much 80% chose bog standard customer satisfaction rating as being the most important. Because obviously the stuff that's related to customer retention and sales, etc., doesn't really apply to them. So, but of the small businesses, so those with revenues of under 10 million, the same proportion, 42%, chose customer retention as their key metric. And to be honest, as a small business owner myself, I kind of agree with that, because retention, it not only implies a satisfied customer, very strongly implies a satisfied customer, it also impacts directly on your sales. So it kind of kills two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
Whereas the likes of NPS and CSAT themselves don't directly correlate with revenue. They are one step removed. Obviously, they are important, etc., etc. But really, when you come down to it, customer retention kind of says, yes, I'm happy, and yes, I'll pay you. What more do you want from a customer, really?
So why do you think kind of the retention doesn't? Because that was the thing that struck me as well. Is that why do you think retention doesn't really feature for larger organizations? I mean, are we to kind of assume that they're not interested?
You've got to understand this covers an awful lot of vertical markets, some of which customer retention won't really be that relevant to.
Right.
But really, going back to what I said before, I think they're certainly interested, yes, but the question was about what is the number one metric that most matter to the board. And perhaps NPS is seen as more kind of scientific and comparable figure that, all the CEOs chat about when they meet up at CEO meetings. I don't know. So this is maybe something they feel most comfortable with. And it's not to say retention doesn't matter. Obviously, it's vastly important, but it's just not selected as number one by many of them.
Yeah, and because I just think maybe it's just kind of about terminology and kind of what it all kind of applies, but it feels like it's that was a massive kind of like difference between smaller businesses and larger businesses. And maybe it's who knows? We could kind of hypothesize about why that might kind of be. I mean, it might be if you're a smaller business, then you are by definition closer to the front line, as it were.
I think, just going away from this particular report and stuff that we've done in the past, it is very noticeable that smaller organizations are, if you like, more sales hungry. They always put it consistently more important than larger organizations. And obviously larger organizations need sales, of course they do, but the smaller guys are, I wouldn't say willing to sacrifice customer satisfaction in terms of sales, but they will ask them to put them next to each other. Then they'll say, I want revenue growth, I want sales, I want retention above a good customer satisfaction rating. Whereas, what I've seen from the very large organizations, that it's customer satisfaction first.
Yeah. So, Steve, I also wanted to ask you about the something else that you kind of you talked about in the article, because you talked about reported that first contact resolution is broadly absent in these metrics, despite your research and other research showing that it plays an important part in CX. And what I want to ask you is why do you think that? I mean, is it that we're getting to the point that we're still struggling with people understanding that service plays an important part in this, and the overall sort of experience, and first contact resolution is an essential part of that? I mean, are boards and senior management still not getting that, or is that just too simplistic?
Yeah, I think the metric itself was what's the number one most important metric to the board,
right? So
it's not to say that first contact resolution isn't important. It's just not as important as some of the other stuff. And probably one of the reasons for that is it's an operational metric born from the contact center rather than being a kind of strategic metric.
Right.
It's also very complex to understand, but it is very, very important to customer satisfaction and the good things that come out of the back of customer satisfaction, like more money.
Right.
And we've done lots of surveys in the past that have shown that first contact is absolutely vital for customer satisfaction, and so it's but it does have to be viewed in context here. So, and what I mean by that is that if you're a business that's kind of improving, you're spending money, you're improving your processes, you're improving your training, you're adding more channels, more choice for customers, what will happen probably to your first contact resolution rate is it will actually decline after you're implementing process improvements. Then a lot of the easy stuff will get handled elsewhere, probably through automation. Customers do self-service, etc. So that means the average difficulty and complexity of the stuff coming into your contact center or through your website or whatever will be more difficult, and as a result, less of it will get resolved first time, because that's just it was the easy stuff before that was keeping your numbers up.
Yeah.
So and that looks bad. Nobody wants to see first contact resolution going down, and it does sound like an excuse if you say to your board and they say, first contact resolution said was really important, now it's going down, what's the matter with it? It sounds like a load of excuses. But what's the options? You've got to kind of take that initial hit and then improve your processes further to kind of drag it back up, which is why we're seeing first contact resolution pretty much stable at about 75% for many, many years. Unlike a lot of other metrics, which are kind of going up and down and here, there, and everywhere, you see a little bit of drop in FCA, and then in the next year it comes back up again. It goes back down, comes back up, and this is just a signal that it's not that people are standing still; it's that process improvements are being made. The average complexity goes up, and it's kind of seesawing around that point, really.
And is that the same number? The 75%? Is that the same number across all sizes of organizations? Is that the general kind of like good practice benchmark, as it were?
Yes, it's less of an issue across size bands and more of an issue across vertical markets. So the type of work that you're doing in the utilities company will be different to what you're doing in manufacturing, for example. And as a result, you kind of see differences, by vertical. But when you're tracking verticals over the years, you see the same patterns. Right.
Okay. And so, is there anything else? I mean, I know that the article was just like some highlights out of the research that you did. I mean, was there anything else that didn't make it into the article that came out of the research that you kind of want to highlight? Because I think it feels like there's a lot there.
There's a huge amount, yeah. Really, some of my favorite stuff comes from the consumer research. I love having loads of data to play with. And it's great to be able to compare consumers with businesses and ask them the same question and see if they come up with the same answers, because they rarely do. And so that was quite fun. So, for example, just a few highlights, if you like. Both businesses and consumers agree that first contact resolution is the most important single factor affecting customer experience. So that was nice. We talked about that. We both agree with that. That's lovely. A short queue or wait time for response is also seen as being vital. So again, you wouldn't think that was particular rocket science, but when you compare that against, that's queue time against, we're not talking about call time or web chat time, because customers are far, far more relaxed about that. Right. As long as they're being dealt with, they don't really mind how long the call takes. Right. Which is interesting. Having UK-based employees is seen as far more important to customers than businesses actually believe, and this is particularly the case in the older generations, and very, very important there, just as important as first contact resolution. Whereas younger customers really value having a choice of channels, and they really appreciate longer opening hours as well. So all types of customers value their time, but the younger customers are very much like, no, I want to call when I want to call. It doesn't matter if it's 11 o'clock at night or if web chat 11 o'clock at night doesn't bother me. You should be there, so I want to do it. Whereas that's not something we get from the older generations. So yeah, I mean that was it. There was also stuff around automation as well. The difference in whether people like that.
And what was your research telling you that? Because I mean, automation is obviously a hot topic in experience right now. I mean, do customers actually want more of it?
Yeah. When I'm writing some of these questions for the question,
obviously.
I'm kind of thinking when I write the questions for the questionnaire, there's some of them I think, well, I know what they're going to say, but I have to ask it because I need to be vaguely scientific about this. And I can't, I said I'm not going to sit there making stuff up, and this was one of them. So the question was, would you prefer to speak with an agent or use automation if the outcome and time were identical? So that's the key thing, absolutely identical.
Right.
Yeah? So I was thinking, as everybody I'm sure would be, the older generation say we want to talk to people, the younger generation say, oh, I don't want to talk to anyone. I'm a millennial. I just want to deal with stuff by web chat or email or what have you.
Right.
In fact, that wasn't the case at all.
No?
Well, I was right half of it. The older generation, yes, 73% of the older generation wanted to talk to somebody. Obviously not much of a surprise, but half of 16 to 34-year-olds did as well, compared to fewer than 30% that preferred to use automation, and the rest of them weren't that bothered either way.
Right.
So it's still very much tilted towards the kind of live agent environment. So that was interesting. That's probably shows me why I should not have preconceptions about things, because not everybody
it blows
thinks
up
the same way.
assumptions, it blows up assumptions, doesn't it? Because there's all sorts of assumptions floating around about Gen Zs and millennials and kind of other kind of folks that just say, oh, they just want to self-serve, they don't want to talk to people and things else. You look
absolutely, or just do everything on social media. It's like, no, that's not what we found.
And which is fascinating, because there is this kind of a bit of a theme that kind of floats around the industry, or is floating around the industry, which says just that this generation kind of want X and not Y. And you're kind of saying, actually, if you ask them, they're going, nah, no, that's not strictly true. There's differences. And so it's not a homogenous kind of preference profile.
Absolutely. And there's one of the things we did, rather than just say, what's your favorite channel, which is a bit of a nothing question, really. So we gave them three scenarios, a high emotion scenario, a high urgency, and a high complexity scenario. So high emotion was, you're really looking forward to getting sent something. You bought something online, you're really looking forward to get it. It turns up and it's the wrong size, it's the wrong color, it's got holes in it, what have you, and you're really annoyed. Now, it's not hugely urgent, perhaps, and it's certainly not hugely complex. But you are probably going to be pretty irritated by it. So that's a high emotion interaction. How do you communicate with the business? So the big one we found here was email. As I said before, email's being seen as very good for complaints when you don't need an immediate resolution. And that pretty much worked across most generations, but the older generation liked the phone as well. And the youngest generation were very, very happy to try web chat here. So you've got you've got the benefit of the email, written. You can have a bit of a vent, but you don't actually have to risk talking to anybody. Right. And it is immediate. And so the second one we looked at was the urgency. So let's say you're picking somebody up from the airport, for example, you need to know if the plane's on time or what have you. So that's an urgent thing. You need to know it. You should find out tomorrow. So that was, as you might expect, mobile app, website service. That was pretty much standard. However, there was a remarkably high proportion of 16 to 24-year-olds who would use email to do that. Right. They obviously haven't had enough experience yet of waiting for an email response from a typical business, which it strikes me as being a bit of a crackers thing to do, but there we are. And the final thing was complexity. So, problems filling your tax return or filling mortgage application, something pretty horrible and difficult to do, but not hugely urgent and certainly not emotional. The older people prefer to visit store or a branch, an office, stuff like that, whereas the youngest would again email. Phone in the contact center was pretty consistent, probably only about 1 in 5 though, which is surprising. Right. That is almost certainly the quickest and most effective way of actually doing that. So really there's a massive mix of channel preferences, age groups, various situations. There's also some socioeconomic stuff thrown in there as well, which I'm not even going to start on. No. So it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, to be honest with you.
It also kind of feels like it feels like there may be an opportunity actually for many kind of firms because there's kind of customers making assumptions about the speed of certain things in certain channels, achieving certain things in certain channels, and maybe there's actually an opportunity for somebody or some companies to turn around and go, if you have X problem or Y problem, then the best channels to use are X, A and B, or A or B sort of thing, rather than going down the C route, which you might think might be quicker, but it's not necessarily, because this is quite a complex thing, if you know what I mean. So almost to provide some guidance on themselves, provide some guidance on actually, if you want better, a faster resolution to this, faster help, then you might want to adopt this channel or that channel, and across different sort of different kind of, groups.
Yeah, like having like the various service levels, current service levels on the website. Yeah, you do that. You'd never get anybody ever using email though, would you?
Well, no, but I just think it's almost a bit like, and some people might be fearful of that because they might, even though it might be quicker to call them, they might go, oh no, everybody's going to call us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then you end up getting into that sort of the fear factor, like we've had kind of in waves over kind of years and years and years where we talked about, well, people got absolutely, wigged out when we talked about 100% self-service guarantee type stuff. And people are like, oh no, they get wigged out because they thought everybody's going to ask for their money back. You think, well, that's silly. And then we had it with kind of surveying customers back in the day when that was a novel thing. And they were like going, oh, but everybody's going to shout at us. And then they realized that that's not going to happen. It didn't happen. And so on and so forth. And so it's, I guess you've got to make sure that we understand kind of like, how our fears kind of like play into our decision making and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've also got something that's kind of counterintuitive. We ask the businesses every year, we've done so for 15 years or something, on a different survey about what the best channel is to use if you've got a complaint. So you want to get your issue sorted quickly. And there was a big wiggle a few years ago towards social media. So that's, kind of shouting, and, if you shout on social media, you get dealt with sooner. And in recent years, that's actually very much dried up. And what you're looking at now is phone. It's gone back to the good old phone. If you want your issue solved, that's the best way of doing it. That's coming from the businesses.
Yeah.
But like I say, will people always want to do that? I don't know. Personally, I think web chat's a really great channel to use. It gives you immediacy. It gives you certain arm's length if that's what you want as well. And, you can go through security on there as well. So it's I think web chat is fantastic, and I'm a bit surprised that it's only still bumping along at maybe 5%.
Wow. Okay. So finally, Steve, a couple of questions just to kind of wrap things up. What do you think some of the big key challenges that you believe kind of like lie ahead for some of the firms in this sort of space? What are the things that they've got to that are going to be rising on the radar that they've got to tackle?
Yeah, well, we've seen there about looking at the channel preferences and things like that. It's not a matter of throwing money into one channel and ignoring the others. There's got to be a balance, and they've got to realise that all channels need to be supported equally well, which is obviously easier said than done. I'm glad that I don't have to do it. Another thing that's probably was kind of tucked away in the report a bit was really the most important factor determining future success of the CX program in general wasn't technology related. Now, a fair amount of the report, not a huge amount, but a fair amount talks about technology and how it's holding back, etc., and what needs to be done. But the businesses are actually saying, well, while technology is not ideal, it's not the most important thing. It's rather the requirement for increasing executive commitment to improving customer experience, and you're building a strategy and executing on that strategy.
Right.
Because as customer experience is by definition multi-departmental, those initiatives can't hope to succeed without an educated, powerful senior champion kind of driving them through, regardless of what each department thinks. Right. Obviously, I don't want to advocate any sort of kind of tyranny here, but it is very important that any CX initiative that goes across more than one department, i.e. all of them, has somebody that's got a certain amount of clout with all of those departments.
And do you think that might be facilitated by helping, almost defining a service and experience strategy and how it will support and enable the overall business's strategy? Yeah,
do you mean it's kind of aligning the goals of the business, what we want to do as a business, or what do we want to do with customer experience?
Exactly, yeah.
This is it. You've got one of the big problems. You've got a huge number of different stakeholders, and a lot of people pulling in different directions. So it's hard enough actually trying to figure out what the business's strategy should be, let alone how customer experience, the CX thing, can support that. But
And any other kind of key takeaways before I ask you my two final questions that are fun questions?
Yeah, fun questions. Cool. Let's have a think. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground with here, actually. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Like I say, it is a pretty substantial report, so feel free to download it, dip in and out, and if anybody's got any questions, then my contact details are on there.
Perfect. So we'll make sure that we get all that kind of like linked up and kind of pointed to. We'll point everybody kind of to the report on the once this gets published. But final couple of questions that I've been asking recently, Steve, on the back of these interviews is it's I guess it's like my ongoing piece of social research, because I published a new book called Punk CX a few months ago, and what I've been doing, I mean, I talked to you before, I explained to you the sort of the premise of the book, and what I've been asking people, I've been asking them a couple of questions, and the first question I've been asking them is like, one word do you think would best describe a punk approach to customer experience?
Probably disruptive. Basically, that's what punk was about, wasn't it? It was ripping up what was old and putting in what was new. And in some cases, it wasn't necessarily better, but it certainly was different. It had energy and it had a direction to it. So, yeah, we'll go with disruptive. Why not?
Fantastic. And the second thing is, can you think of any companies or brands that you think sort of epitomizes that sort of punk CX ethos?
Yeah, you kind of warned me you were going to ask me this question. I was scratching my head about it for quite a long time. And in the end, I had to ask an expert, my wife, who both from a professional and a personal viewpoint is far more interesting and thoughtful consumer than I am. So she's basically identified online's women fashion as being a real kind of CX battleground. So, she gave me a few examples and showed me some stuff. So you've got Bowden keeping an eye out on how often and how much you buy and posting out time-sensitive vouchers if you've kind of drifted away from them. Yeah. And not only that, but if you don't get around to using that voucher in time, they kind of send you emails as well with the voucher on it saying like, don't forget this one, so that, you've got companies like Outnet and Other Stories and Net-a-Porter, and they kind of curate collections. It's getting towards personalization. It's not quite there yet, but it's curating collections that make the customer kind of feel in the know about what's hot. They're often VIP benefits, early sale entry, et cetera, and that kind of makes the customer feel like really special and valued and things like that. And it's an incredibly competitive marketplace. So, that's really kind of key to grabbing the customer's ego. And in the offline world, you've got Lakeland. Their shop assistants have kind of an old-fashioned method of service. So, they'll ask you if you found everything you wanted, and if not, take you by the hand to what you were looking for. Yeah. But they also do a cross-sell of, as often a cheap, high-quality product, and something that's kind of pretty much guaranteed to be something that you're happy with and think, wow, that was really cool. And again, it's making the customer feel again in the know and valued. But, final point really for me is that there's a limited amount of personalization happening at the moment. And I think that is kind of going to be the real big battleground for customer experience in the future.
Fantastic. Steve, that's been awesome. I mean, first of all, thank you for spending some time with me today and sort of like sharing some of the insights from your research, and also for kind of digging into it for us kind of a little bit, so to uncover some of the highlights and the insights. So I just want to say thank you for sharing your time and your experience with us today. That's been great.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as we say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.